This time on Poll Hub, the election's over, but the counting continues and the questions are flying. What happened? What happened to the polling industry is one of the big questions. And yeah, we have something to say about that. So let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director for the Marist Poll and Executive Producer of Poll Hub.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So we record this just after noon on November 5th on Thursday. We tell you that because things are changing so rapidly that you may be listening to this podcast at any time from, once it's published to, over the weekend or whatever. So at this moment, let's just set the stage. We do not know who the President of the United States is. There are several states that are continuing to count ballots. In fact, there will be ballots counted for weeks on end. In New York, where we are, we know about how long absentee ballots take to count. So the count goes on. But one of the things that emerged even on election night was something that we want to address. We're a poll. We were live with the podcast, on election night, so we were there. And that is somehow that the polls blew it in 2020. So it's the elephant in the room, and that's not a partisan elephant. There's a donkey in here too with us. What do we say about that?
Oh boy, we all want to jump in.
Who wants to go first? I'm just going to say, I'll say one simple thing, and then you guys can all jump in. I think there's a tendency that the analysis of polls, let alone the election, occurs somewhat prematurely. Tough to measure when the count is still being made. And I think there's a tendency immediately that next morning to say the polls were wrong, or the story you never hear the polls are right. But this time it was the polls were wrong. I think they get ahead of their skis on that in terms of trying to put a label on the accuracy of the polls and the success or failure.
And let's be clear that came from a couple of pollsters. That storyline was pretty strongly put out on election night by Frank Luntz as one example and a couple others. So this is coming from inside the house to some degree as well.
Yeah, major newspapers also joined in the fray.
Sure.
Well, I think also, what's really difficult is when we look at the difference between expectations going into an election and an election night, and then what is the reality of counting votes and how those results end up turning out. I think that one of the things that is very different this time around was certainly the enormous number of people who voted. And for pollsters, it wasn't just the number that voted, but it was how they were voting. They were voting by mail. They were voting in person in some early vote states. And then, of course, there was the group of voters that were voting on election day. And so for polling and pre-election polling, I think some of the misses can be accounted for by the fact that we didn't know what the denominator was. In other words, we don't have the proportion. We don't know how many voters were actually going to vote in total. And quite frankly, we don't really know that now either because the votes are still in process. And that's why Lee is saying we need to be patient and we need to wait for the count before we start writing the polling industry obituary, because we really don't know how close or far off the polls were. But I think but just one thing, I think what we can say though, is that we were certainly off in terms of the expectation that was set for election night.
Yeah, and I think I'll just underscore that point. We shouldn't start the post-election autopsy until the body has ceased functioning.
This is an awful analogy. Please.
We're going right to NCIS.
Okay, let me try
try
another one.
I get.
We don't know the recipe.
But
we don't know the recipe of how many people were doing each part, so we just don't know how to say what might have occurred.
Well put.
You think?
Well, yeah. There's another way to look at this. In 2018, on this time after 2018 and 2018 elections, on that Thursday, the storyline was that Republicans did pretty well. Democrats didn't make a dent. and that it was a disappointment for Democrats. The midterm elections should be a big win for the party out of power, and it wasn't. Fast forward 2 weeks, it was being called a blue tsunami. So that's why there's no reason, there's no rational reason to talk about, did the polls do well? Did the media do well? Did any of that? There's no way to talk about that right now because the votes haven't finished counting. The story's not written. We're in the middle of like Act 1, maybe the beginning of Act 2, but it's a 3-act play. So settle down. We don't have much to say about this.
And so that wraps it up for this edition.
We have lots to say. Come on.
No.
Oh,
We don't have much. We don't have much to say about that storyline because that storyline is not necessarily accurate. There's no way to play that storyline out right now. There you go.
What we can speak to is our transparency as a polling organization. And that's something that our listeners know, that we always like to pull the curtain back in terms of what it is that we do and how we take our polls and conduct our polls. And so, Barb, why don't you just share a little bit about how we did approach our election polls going into Tuesday, and how we did deal with some of the potential challenges given this unprecedented election year.
Yeah, one of the things which I have alluded to already is the fact that as we were looking towards Election Day, we were using some estimates that were done by the Election Project and aggregated by the Election Project, and aggregated from the state, each of the state's Secretary of States or Board of Election sites about who was voting, or at least the number of people who are voting. And in the states that have party enrollment, which means voters do register as Democrats or Republicans or something else. And so we were trying to base our estimates on what we thought these different groups were doing. There was an enormous number of states this time around that allowed for early voting. Even New York State, whose election laws have been archaic, and you have to show up on Election Day or not at all, or have a really good excuse as to why you're not going to be at your precinct. They allowed for election, early voting as well. So that presented a little bit more of a challenge for pre-election pollsters to estimate how many people were going to be sending in their ballots by mail, how many plan to vote in person if they could, and how many plan to vote on Election Day. Now, that wouldn't be a big deal if it was just randomly distributed across the parties. In other words, Democrats and Republicans were just as likely to use any particular method of voting, but not so. Democrats overwhelmingly were more likely to vote by mail. In person in most states was more Democratic, but for instance, in Arizona, it was pretty even between Democrats and Republicans. And Election Day itself was, and as we saw by the returns that were put up on election night by the networks and the cables, that was pretty Republican. So Lee talks about the recipe. Well, that was part of it. And we didn't know what the whole was. We didn't know how many voters from each state were actually going to be voting. So we had to make a best guess based on the number of people who had already returned ballots, the number of absentee ballots that had gone out, and the number of voters, believe it or not, who had voted in the past. We assumed that there was going to be many more voters who were voting, but how many more was something that we also had to make a best guess or estimate about as well. So those were some of the things that we were dealing with going into Election Day.
And I would just add to this discussion that we know, and we've talked about it here, and if you've been in any of our classes at Marist, you hear this right off the start. Polls are estimates within a certain margin of error. That doesn't mean there's something wrong. It just means we allow a certain range. In our likely voter models, that was 4.7% in both directions. Now, people in the media and generally people like us, I mean, we'd like to say, people are ahead, people are behind, people are catching up, there's momentum, there's slippage. But technically and statistically, I should say, you could be ahead in quotes, by 6 points, but that's not beyond the margin of error because it's 4.7 in both directions. In that case, it would be 9.4. would be the range. So technically, that doesn't tell you someone who is ahead. Editorially, that's not very satisfying, and we get
Well, and
into that. Yeah.
as an industry, we do. I mean, yes, we have the margin of error, but we do have to do better than that.
Yes.
I
Of
mean, I
course.
think if you look at the releases, if you look at the characterizations by pollsters, and particularly the state pollsters, I mean, I did see, some folks kind of laugh when some of the pollsters were trying to say it's an edge. 6 points is an edge in a state, because it just looks like it's so much more than that. And editorially, it is. And I think as pollsters, we do have to move to a point where we do have greater precision, when people are looking at those numbers. But that is a risk. I think that there were both misses, but there are also polls that were very much on target, particularly as we got close to election day. But as we found in 2016, as we're finding in many elections, once the narrative gets rolling, the last few polls don't do a lot to change it. They're much more likely to be considered outliers. They're much more likely to be considered something that isn't correct and to be discounted. So, Ann Seltzer with the Des Moines Register took a lot of hits with her 7-point Trump lead in Iowa uh, uh, on the last weekend. And it was pretty much discounted, and that somehow, she had missed this one. She'd
It was
missed.
an outlier. It was an outlier.
And so it's really hard
That's what people thought.
to move that narrative, as you get to the last weekend. We had a tie in Arizona, and again, it was looked at. Oh, this must be an outlier. This can't be right. We had a closer race in Pennsylvania, and we get the same kind of a narrative because, particularly with the forecasters, they need a large database of polls in order to make their forecasts, in order to make their judgments.
These are like the Nate Silver 538 and YouGov and the Economist. They do their models about many thousands of simulations and come up with that Joe Biden was going to win, likelihood of 90% or 95%. And that really shapes the fact that Donald Trump is about to be repudiated. And his 4 years, he's going to get tossed out. And the polls really weren't saying that. Joe Biden was ahead narrowly, if you want to use the word ahead, technically within the margin of error in a lot of places. And that's sort of what's emerging. Narrow victories in a lot of places. So again, we can't get ahead of the story when votes are still being counted.
There's a lot of counting to be done. So even even talking about our own polls that did well or didn't do well, there's a long way to go. In 2016, the polling industry, under the auspices of the American Association for Polling Opinion Research, which is our umbrella organization of people who work in this industry, put together, did a deep dive to figure out what went wrong in 2016. What is going to happen, do you think, in 2020 now? And what are we doing? You got to be doing stuff right the day after. Every poll's got to be doing something to kind of set the stage of what are we looking at, how are we investigating, what are we preparing for? Because once the numbers are all in, now we have something to look at. We have something to gauge against. We have real numbers.
Exactly.
So what are we doing?
Well, I was just going to say I was on that committee, and that's the one that sort of underscored the weight by education thesis, the magic bullet of coming out of 2016.
Yeah. So how did that go?
Well, magic bullets are just that. They're magic bullets, and I interestingly, Ann Silver doesn't weight by education.
Ann Seltzer.
Ann Seltzer. I'm sorry.
That's it. Ann Silver is apparently some kind of relation between Nate Silver and Ann Seltzer.
Yeah. So, but she doesn't. We don't, unless our numbers are so far off, and they haven't been. But just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, Barb, 2020. It's right now, 2 days out. What are we doing?
Well, I think what's really important, and I know you guys have heard me say this so many times, but science is hard. And so if we look at 2016, there were a lot of theories. There was this education theory, there was the shy Trump voter theory, but there's nothing that was really backed up with fact and with science. So what we're doing as we are waiting for the final results, because as you point out, Jay, we can't fix something either that's not broken. So we'll be looking at how close or how far away our estimates were. But what we generally do right out of the starting block is we first do a recall survey to those people who we spoke with in the final week of the election, of the campaign, that is. So we will be calling back into the folks we spoke to in Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. And what will we be asking them? Did they vote? Did they actually end up voting? We won't ask it quite that way. We will be asking them how they voted. In the past, in the original poll, they told us whether they were going to vote by mail, in person, early, or on election day. We're going to find out what they ended up doing, and then finally, we're going to ask them, well, who did you actually end up voting for? And we will be able to compare that with the information that they gave us previously, along with some opinions and attitudes about what they thought the issues were when they actually did vote. Because one of the things that we saw was that people were kind of going back and forth between the issue of coronavirus and the economy, and which was really paramount in their mind when they cast their vote. And that was something that was very telling, um, and in determining who they ultimately voted for. So that's one thing. The other thing is we'll be going through the samples to just make sure that they were representative, both demographically, but more importantly, geographically, because we know that geographic differences end up with attitudinal differences. And so we want to make sure that there aren't biases in how we selected the sample, in other words, the phone numbers of the people that we actually called, and make sure that they are representative of the states and the populations that we were speaking with. So those are two main things that we will be looking at. And I think the last thing is that there were differences again between the state and the national polls. We also did both. Unfortunately, didn't have the bandwidth to do a national poll close to election day. Ours was 3 weeks out, but there were differences. And we need to evaluate that because there is such a significant difference between the overall popular vote, as we've said time and time again, and also the state vote and the electoral college. And what I think affects um, what can affect the national polls, and why we may have seen some large margins, and again, we need to scientifically understand this, is the fact that a lot of the sampling folks, if you're not taking geography into account, you actually overcount some of those more urban areas, even within states that tend to be red, more conservative, and have larger rural populations.
And the spread this time between urban, suburban, and rural in terms of voter preferences seems to be getting even greater. And I assume, Barb, all these steps we'll have by breakfast tomorrow
Not at
morning. We're going to
all.
be reporting
Not
on
at
it.
all. As I've always said, science is hard. Science takes time. You have all those memes that tell you, "Oh, try because, it's good to fail because that's how you learn." And well, this is what science is. We can fail a lot because we're making certain assumptions, and we have to test those assumptions, those hypotheses, and those ideas.
And again, that gets back to what Mary said, transparency. Sometimes in social media you get hammered, but you're being transparent. Mary, before we go, I would like you, in the interest of full transparency, to acknowledge that behind us election night and all the time are an army of students who you work very closely with, in addition to getting all our poll findings out the door and all those other things. But maybe you could just talk just for a few moments about all these students who had a front row seat to the election, through interviewing, and on election night itself?
Absolutely. So we have an amazing team of students with whom we work at the Marist Poll. Jay and I work closely with our college to career interns who work with us on our media and social media, rather, our content that we put out that you see on all of our social media channels. And then we have our data team who works with Stephanie Carvalho and Daniela Charter, who handle our survey center, as well as our number crunching. They have much more formal titles than I just shared. But for
Chief Number
simplicity,
Cruncher.
Yeah, that's okay. That sounds kind of cool.
I like that. Yeah.
for simplicity purposes, we'll stick with that
Is
right
it
now.
good for
But
breakfast?
it's amazing for breakfast. It doesn't, well, anyway, we won't go there.
Oh,
No
please.
indigestion. But our students worked with us on election night in terms of our analysis. They kept track of the projections that were being made. They helped us create our content. And that also includes our newsfeed media assistants as well. So we did provide them with a front row seat to what was going on election night, and we will continue to do that in terms of the processes that take place between now and inauguration and beyond. So,
And I would just conclude by saying I sort of sit atop this, army of students and the staff that we have, and I think, in not that Marist or the poll needs any plugging here, but I will. I mean, I think to have students who can work directly with you, Mary, and Jay, who have both had, I know, real world experience. No, you're professional media folks, and you really have been in so many different places doing so many different things and have so much experience. And to share that with these students, I think is really great. And to share it with us. I mean, we love the conversations we all have amongst ourselves. So, I mean, I think that is an important point to stress here as we move on to the next phase, which is class tonight with our students. And Mary and I will be doing that with our political communication students.
And we're going to keep watching the counts.
and we certainly can't do what we do without our students. But that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
And Mary is our executive producer, and now she's wearing two hats. And Casey Schaff is our editor, and Amelia Morell, and Leo Ruiz, and Madeline Jones, and Marcelo Bettman. You guys do all these things, including pronouncing your names better than I just did. But we couldn't do all this without you, and we thank you as students to help out with all the things we do.
And note that Marcello there is actually our editor. He now edits this podcast,
yes.
and we don't make it easy for him. So thank you, Marcello, for sticking in there with us. Follow us on social media, by the way. If you didn't see us on election night, we were answering questions on Facebook and on Twitter. So follow us there. We're at Marist Poll on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, too. Barb's letting the dog out, so we're going to wrap this one. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, and we will see you next time.
Take care, everybody.